My name is Nadia Hollis. I'm 37 years old. I restore antique furniture for a living, which means I spend most of my professional life with my hands inside 200-year-old joints that are cracked but not yet broken, learning exactly where the real stress is hiding before I ever apply any pressure of my own. That instinct is the only reason I didn't say a single word when my Aunt Priscilla stood beside the dessert table at my great Aunt Augusta's 90th birthday party, in front of nearly 60 guests, and said, loudly enough for half the room to hear, "Old money doesn't go to people like you, dear. It goes to people who actually understand how to carry it." I set down the small plate of cake I'd been holding. I did the thing I do every single day in my workshop when something delicate is under more stress than it looks like it can bear. I went still, and I waited, and I looked closely at exactly where the pressure was actually coming from before I decided whether it needed to be released. Because what Priscilla didn't know, standing there in her pearls beside a three-tiered cake she hadn't paid a cent toward, was that 6 weeks earlier, in a quiet, unhurried afternoon at Augusta's estate, my great-aunt had already signed the document that would make her entire sentence, and everything it implied about who actually belonged to this family's history, completely, permanently beside the point. If you've ever been told, by the people who share your blood, that you simply weren't built for what they had, stay with me to the end, because this one has an object in it, a very specific, very old writing desk that ends up meaning more than anyone at that party could have understood. Subscribe and drop the word belong in the comments right now before we even begin. Let me take you back to the actual beginning, because you need the whole shape of this family's particular kind of wealth and this family's particular kind of exclusion to understand exactly what Priscilla's sentence got wrong and what it cost her to say it out loud. My grandmother, Constance, was born into the Pemberton family, one of those old East Coast families whose money had stopped being new so long ago that nobody in it could actually remember the specific ancestor who'd first earned any of it. Shipping money, originally, 3 generations back, grown and compounded and quietly reinvested until it had become something closer to an identity than an actual, countable fortune. The Pembertons had a family compound on the coast of Maine, a summer house that had been in continuous use since before either World War, a family crest, unofficially, that appeared on stationery nobody had ever formally commissioned but that everyone simply understood to be theirs. Constance was the younger of 2 sisters, and Augusta, 4 years older, was, from the earliest accounts I ever heard, always understood to be the more serious, more dutiful of the two. The daughter who cared about the family's history, who learned the provenance of every piece of furniture in the summer house, who could recite, from memory, exactly which great-great-uncle had commissioned which portrait. Constance, by contrast, was the sister who fell in love, at 19, with a man named Walter Hollis, a skilled carpenter from a working-class family 2 towns over, who'd been hired one summer to repair a section of the compound's boathouse and had, in the process, apparently repaired something in Constance's understanding of what her own life might actually look like, outside the specific, narrow track her family had always assumed she'd follow. The family's response to that marriage, as it was described to me many times over the years, growing up, was not violent or dramatic in any way that made for an easy, singular story to point to. It was simply permanently cold. Constance was not disowned outright. The Pembertons were far too concerned with appearances for anything that dramatic. But she was, from that point forward, quietly, thoroughly demoted within the family's actual social architecture. She was still invited to the large, formal gatherings, the Christmas parties, the significant birthdays, but she was seated, always, at the edges of things, introduced, when introduced at all, as Augusta's sister who married the carpenter, a phrase that followed her, unchanged, for the rest of her life, regardless of how many decades passed or how much Walter Hollis eventually built, through his own hard, skilled work, a genuinely comfortable and dignified life for his family. I grew up hearing about the wealthy branch of my family, the way you hear about relatives who exist, mostly as a story rather than a lived reality. Occasional, strained visits to the summer house for a significant family event, my grandmother dressing carefully and nervously beforehand in a way that even I, as a young child, could sense meant something more complicated than ordinary excitement. I remember, specifically, being maybe 8 years old at some large family gathering at the main compound, watching my cousins. Priscilla's children, roughly my own age, moved through that enormous house with an easy, unthinking confidence I didn't yet have language for, while I stood near my grandmother, aware, in the particular, wordless way children absorb social hierarchy long before anyone. Explains it to them directly that we were guests in a house that was, on paper, as much a part of my own family's history as anyone else's, and yet somehow entirely, permanently theirs. I want to describe one specific memory from that same childhood visit, because I think it captures the texture of my grandmother's particular kind of exclusion more precisely than a general description ever could. There was a formal photograph taken that afternoon, the whole extended family gathered on the compound's wide front steps, the kind of photograph that ends up framed and displayed for decades afterward. I remember the photographer arranging everyone carefully, by generation and by branch. And I remember, with a clarity that has never fully faded, watching my grandmother hesitate, just slightly, at the edge of the group, until Augusta herself, noticing, reached back and pulled her sister forward into the frame, saying something too quiet for me to hear. The photograph that resulted shows my grandmother standing at the very end of the second row, technically included, visibly separate. I saw that same photograph, framed, still hanging in the compound's main hallway decades later, and I understood, looking at it as an adult, exactly how literally that single image had captured the entire shape of my grandmother's relationship to her own family. My grandmother never spoke bitterly about any of this, which I think, looking back, made the whole dynamic even harder for me to fully process as a child. She spoke of her sister Augusta with genuine, uncomplicated love, and of the family's wealth with a kind of gentle, wistful distance, as though it belonged to a story she'd once been a character in but had long since stepped outside of. I remember asking her once, as a teenager, whether it had ever hurt her, being treated the way she was by her own family. She thought about it for a long moment before answering, in the careful, unhurried way she answered most difficult questions. I think, for a long time, I mistook their coldness for a judgment on my choices, she said. But your grandfather built things with his own two hands that lasted longer and meant more than half of what sits in that house. I think, eventually, I stopped needing them to understand that because I understood it myself, and that turned out to be enough. What she did pass down to me, deliberately and with real intention, wasn't any claim to that wealth, but something she considered far more valuable. An appreciation for craftsmanship itself, for the specific, quiet dignity of working with your hands to make or repair something that would genuinely outlast you. She'd learned this, I think, in part from my grandfather Walter, and in part from her own complicated relationship to a family whose wealth she'd been raised inside of, but whose actual, hands-on relationship to the objects that wealth had accumulated always struck her as strangely absent. I inherited that appreciation directly, and it shaped the entire course of my working life. I apprenticed, starting at 19, under a master furniture restorer in a small workshop 2 hours from where I grew up, learning the painstaking, deeply satisfying work of repairing and preserving genuinely old, genuinely fine pieces of furniture, understanding wood grain, historical joinery techniques, the specific chemistry of period-appropriate finishes. I built, over the following 15 years, a small but genuinely respected reputation in this specific, narrow field, working with museums, historical societies, and private collectors who valued the kind of careful, patient expertise that mass-market furniture restoration simply doesn't require. It was through this work, entirely independent of any family connection, that I first came into direct contact with my great-aunt Augusta, roughly 8 years ago, in a way that neither of us initially understood as anything other than a straightforward professional engagement. Augusta's estate manager, coordinating an extensive restoration project for several significant pieces in the main compound's collection. Furniture that had sat, deteriorating slowly, for decades, had found my name through a referral from a regional historical society I'd done previous work for. I was hired, initially, without anyone involved in that hiring process, realizing that the restorer they'd brought in was, in fact, Augusta's own great-niece, the granddaughter of the sister who'd married the carpenter and been quietly written out of the family's social register decades earlier. I want to describe the specific afternoon everything shifted, because I've turned it over in my memory many times since understanding, now, how much weight that single conversation eventually carried. I was working, that day, on a writing desk, a genuinely significant piece, commissioned by one of the original shipping money ancestors nearly 200 years earlier, its surface badly water damaged from decades of sitting near a drafty window nobody had thought to move it away from. Augusta, then in her early 80s, still sharp and formidably present, had come down to the room where I was working, ostensibly to check on the progress of the restoration, and had stayed, unexpectedly, for nearly 2 hours, watching me work, asking increasingly specific, genuinely curious questions about the techniques I was using. At some point during that conversation, she asked my full name, and I told her, Nadia Hollis. And I watched something shift, almost imperceptibly, across her face. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, carefully, Hollis. That's an unusual name to hear in this particular room. I explained, a little uncertain of how the information would land, that my grandmother had been Constance Pemberton before her marriage, that I was, in fact, her great-niece, working in this house entirely by professional coincidence rather than any deliberate family connection. Augusta's response to that revelation was not what I'd braced myself for, based on the decades of careful family distance my grandmother had described to me my entire life. She sat down, slowly, in a nearby chair, and said, quietly, I haven't spoken to your grandmother properly in longer than I care to admit. That's a genuine failing of mine, and I don't say that lightly. She looked at the desk I was working on, at my hands, still faintly stained with the specific finish I'd been applying, and said something I've thought about many times since. You know, your grandmother was always the one in our family who actually cared about these objects, the real weight of them, not just what they signified. I think I've spent most of my life mistaking her marriage for a kind of loss to the family, when I think, watching you work today, it might have actually been the opposite. It might have been the one branch of this family that kept the actual point of all this. That conversation began a relationship between Augusta and me that unfolded, quietly and without much fanfare, over the following 8 years. A relationship built almost entirely around the restoration work itself, but that gradually, steadily, deepened into something genuinely personal. I continued working on pieces throughout the main compound, visiting regularly, and Augusta began, increasingly, to seek out my company specifically, beyond any professional necessity. Long afternoons where she'd walk me through the compound's collection, telling me the actual history behind each piece. History I don't think she'd shared with anyone in the family in years, because, as she told me once, quite plainly, none of them have ever actually asked. You're the first person in this family, in longer than I can remember, who's wanted to know the story rather than just the appraisal value. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters for understanding the full shape of what eventually happened. I never once, over those 8 years, thought of my relationship with Augusta as building toward any kind of inheritance or financial benefit. I genuinely, simply enjoyed her company, valued the specific, rare kind of historical and craft knowledge she held, and felt, increasingly, a real affection for a woman who had, by her own admission, spent much of her adult life mistaking careful stewardship for something narrower and more anxious than it needed to be. I want to describe one particular afternoon from those 8 years, roughly 4 years into our relationship, because I think it shows the actual texture of what Augusta and I built together more vividly than a general summary can. It was late autumn, and I'd come up to the compound to assess a badly damaged sideboard in the dining room, but Augusta, instead of leaving me to work alone as she often did, pulled a chair close and asked if I'd mind if she simply sat with me for the afternoon. She'd brought, without explanation, an old cigar box full of loose photographs, decades old, and as I worked, she began sorting through them, narrating as she went. A photograph of her own mother, young, laughing, standing beside a car that had clearly been a significant extravagance at the time. A photograph of Augusta and Constance as girls, arms around each other, taken years before whatever quiet family calculus would eventually separate them. She held up that last photograph for a long time, studying it, and then she said something I've never forgotten. I used to tell myself I loved your grandmother the whole time, even after everything, she said. And I did, in my own limited way. But love without actually showing up for someone isn't really love, is it? It's just a feeling you get to keep telling yourself you have, without any of the inconvenient cost of proving it. She set the photograph down, carefully, on the sideboard I was working on, and watched me continue sanding a damaged corner in silence for several minutes before she spoke again. I think this is the most time I've spent with anyone in this house in years, just sitting, just talking. Everyone else who comes through here wants something from the house itself. You're the first person who's ever seemed like you just wanted to understand it. That afternoon became, in a sense, the actual template for the following 4 years of our relationship. Long, unhurried visits, Augusta gradually opening up entire decades of family history I'd never had access to. History that, I came to realize, she'd been carrying largely alone for years, with no one else in the family particularly interested in hearing it. I learned, over those visits, about ancestors I'd never known existed, about the specific hardships and choices that had actually built the family's wealth, generations back, choices far more complicated and less romantic than the smooth, confident version of old money the rest of the family seemed to take for granted. I came to understand, slowly, that Augusta's relationship to her own family's history was lonelier than I'd ever imagined, and that our growing friendship was filling a specific, significant absence that had existed in her life for a very long time. If anything, I remained acutely aware, throughout those years, of exactly how the rest of the family, Priscilla, Augusta's daughter, and Priscilla's own 2 adult children, my cousins Bitsy and Chip, regarded my growing presence at the compound, which is to say, with a specific, careful wariness that never fully resolved into open hostility, but never warmed into genuine welcome either. I met Priscilla properly, for the first time as an adult, at a family Christmas gathering roughly 5 years into my relationship with Augusta, an event I'd been invited to, for the first time in my adult life, at Augusta's specific insistence. I remember the drive up to the compound that year with a specific, nervous anticipation. I'd spent years, by that point, visiting for professional purposes, always slightly apart from any genuine family occasion. And this felt, somehow, like crossing into territory I wasn't entirely sure I was actually welcome in, regardless of Augusta's explicit invitation. Priscilla was gracious in the particular, practiced way people are gracious when they've decided, in advance, exactly how much genuine warmth a situation actually requires. She asked polite, surface-level questions about my work, my life, nodding along to my answers with an attentiveness that somehow still managed to feel entirely absent of real curiosity. I remember, specifically, describing a recent project I'd completed, a significant restoration for a historical society 2 states away, and watching Priscilla's expression remain politely fixed throughout my entire explanation, offering, at the end, only a brief, "That sounds like very careful work," before turning, smoothly, to greet another arriving guest. My cousins, Bitsy and Chip, were friendlier, in a looser, more casual way, though I noticed, even then, a certain performative quality to their warmth. The specific, easy friendliness people extend to someone they've already decided doesn't pose any genuine threat to their own position. Chip, in particular, spent much of the evening making good-natured but slightly condescending jokes about the help, a phrase he used, apparently affectionately, to refer generally to anyone in the extended family or household staff engaged in hands-on, practical work, a category he seemed, without ever saying so directly, to have quietly placed me within. I want to describe one specific interaction from that Christmas gathering, because it foreshadowed, in miniature, exactly the dynamic that would eventually explode at Augusta's 90th birthday party years later. Late in the evening, several of us were gathered near the compound's enormous library, and Chip, a little loosened by wine, mentioned, casually, that Augusta had been talking your ear off about the furniture again. I bet, a comment delivered with the specific, condescending affection people reserve for something they consider charmingly beneath their own real interests. I mentioned, carefully, that I actually found the family's history genuinely fascinating, that Augusta's knowledge of the collection was remarkable. Priscilla, overhearing, smiled thinly and said, "It's sweet that you indulge her. Mother does love finding someone new to explain all that to. I think she gets lonely for people who actually want to sit through it." I didn't say anything in response, in that moment, though I remember feeling, distinctly, the specific sting of being characterized as someone merely indulging, a genuine, deepening relationship I valued enormously, rather than someone actually, sincerely engaged in it. I drove home that night, turning the whole exchange over carefully in my mind, understanding, even then, that Priscilla's framing wasn't really about me at all. It was about her own relationship to her mother, and to the family's history and wealth more broadly. A relationship that, I came to understand over the following years, had always been oriented primarily around the money and status those things represented, rather than any genuine curiosity about the actual objects, or the actual stories, or the actual craftsmanship that had accumulated, generation after generation, into the specific, tangible wealth the family so carefully protected. Augusta's health began declining meaningfully about 2 years before her 90th birthday. A slow, manageable decline rather than any sudden crisis, but enough that the family's conversations, increasingly, began turning toward questions of estate planning, succession, the eventual future of the compound, and its extensive collection. I want to be honest that I largely stayed out of these conversations, both because they genuinely weren't my place, as an outside professional rather than an official member of the family's inner circle, and because I remained, throughout, entirely uninterested in positioning myself for any kind of inheritance. My relationship with Augusta had never been transactional, and I had no intention of allowing anyone's assumptions about my motives to change that. It was during this period, roughly 18 months before her 90th birthday, that Augusta first raised, directly with me, during one of our long afternoon conversations, the subject of what would eventually happen to the compound and its collection once she was gone. I remember the specific afternoon clearly. We were in the room where I'd first met her, years earlier, working on a different piece by then, a badly weakened set of dining chairs from the same original shipping money era. Augusta sat nearby, watching, and said, without much preamble, "I've been thinking a great deal, Nadia, about what actually happens to all of this once I'm not here to explain it anymore." I told her, honestly, that I assumed those decisions were entirely hers to make, and that I had no expectation of any role in them beyond, perhaps, continuing whatever restoration work the estate might still require under whoever eventually took over its stewardship. She was quiet for a long moment, working something over in her mind, and then she said something that, at the time, I didn't fully understand the weight of. "I've watched Priscilla and her children move through this house for decades," she said. "They know the appraisal value of nearly everything in it. I don't think either of my grandchildren could tell you, with any real understanding, why a single piece in this entire collection actually matters, beyond what it's worth. I think, somewhere along the way, I let this family's relationship to its own history become entirely about protecting a number, rather than protecting the actual, specific things that number was ever meant to represent." I didn't press her further in that conversation, sensing, correctly, that she was still working through something significant on her own terms, in her own time. But over the following year, in a series of quiet, unhurried conversations, she began, gradually, to share more of her actual thinking with me. A thinking that had clearly been building, slowly, over the better part of a decade, ever since that first afternoon watching me work on the water-damaged writing desk. 6 weeks before her 90th birthday, Augusta called me directly, asking if I could come to the compound for what she described only as an important conversation, and I'd like you to bring nothing with you but yourself, no tools this time. I arrived to find her, along with her longtime estate attorney, a careful, soft-spoken man named Harold Whitfield, waiting in the compound's formal study, a room I'd worked in previously, restoring several pieces, but had never been invited into for any purpose beyond that work. Augusta explained, plainly and without much preamble, what she'd decided. She had restructured the family trust, the legal vehicle that held the compound, its full collection, and a substantial accompanying financial endowment intended for the property's ongoing preservation, to name me as its sole trustee and primary beneficiary, effective upon her death, with specific, detailed provisions governing the trust's ongoing purpose. The preservation, not the liquidation, of the family's collection and history, administered by someone who had, in Augusta's own words in the document itself, which Harold read aloud to me that afternoon, demonstrated, consistently, and without any expectation of personal benefit, the specific kind of genuine stewardship this family's wealth was always meant to protect, rather than merely inherit. I want to be honest about how that afternoon actually felt, because I don't think a clean, triumphant reaction fully captures it. I was stunned, genuinely, and also deeply uncertain in the moment about what accepting such a role would actually mean, both practically and in terms of the inevitable, significant conflict it would create with the rest of the family. I told Augusta, honestly, that I was moved beyond words, but that I was also concerned about what this decision would do to her relationship with Priscilla and with Bitsy and Chip once it eventually became known. Augusta's response to that concern has stayed with me every day since. "I'm 90 years old in 6 weeks. Nadia," she said. "I've spent most of my life being careful not to disrupt this family's comfortable assumptions about itself. I don't think careful is actually a virtue at this point in my life if what it's protecting is a version of this family that's forgotten what any of this was actually for. I'd rather leave this in the hands of someone who understands it, even if that decision costs me some difficult conversations in whatever time I have left, then leave it in the hands of people who'll simply convert it into something smaller and less meaningful than it's ever been." She asked me, that afternoon, to keep the details of the trust private until she'd had the opportunity to discuss it with Priscilla directly, on her own terms and in her own time. A request I honored completely, telling no one, not even close friends, about what had been decided. I want you to hold on to that timeline carefully, because it matters enormously for understanding exactly what happened 6 weeks later, at Augusta's actual birthday party, and exactly how badly Priscilla misjudged the situation she was walking into. What I didn't know, until much later, was that Augusta had, in fact, attempted to have that conversation with Priscilla in the weeks leading up to her birthday, and had been met, each time, with a kind of dismissive impatience that suggested Priscilla assumed whatever her mother wanted to discuss could simply be addressed after the party, once things have settled down, an assumption that, I think, reveals a great deal about how little Priscilla had ever genuinely engaged with her mother's actual concerns, as opposed to the practical logistics surrounding her care and her eventual estate. The 90th birthday party itself was held at the main compound, an enormous, formal affair. Nearly 60 guests gathered across the property's expansive lawn and into the main house as the evening cooled, catering staff moving carefully among long tables, a small string quartet playing near the water. I attended at Augusta's specific, insistent invitation, and I want to be honest that I felt, throughout much of that early evening, the same familiar, low-grade wariness I'd carried at every family gathering since that first Christmas years earlier. Aware, always, of existing at a kind of permanent edge within this particular family's social architecture, regardless of how genuinely close my relationship with Augusta herself had become. I want to describe the early part of that evening a little more fully, because it matters for understanding just how ordinary and celebratory it felt before everything shifted. Augusta herself was in wonderful spirits that night, moving slowly but steadily through the crowd with the help of a cane she'd only recently, reluctantly, begun using, greeting old friends and distant relatives with the same warm, formidable presence she'd carried her entire life. I spent much of the early evening near her, helping her navigate the uneven lawn, and I watched her light up, repeatedly, at the arrival of guests she hadn't seen in years. A specific, genuine joy that made the whole evening feel, for a long stretch, exactly like what it was supposed to be: a warm, well-earned celebration of a long, complicated life. I spoke, at one point, with my cousin Bitsy, who'd always been the friendlier of Priscilla's two children, and who asked, with what seemed like genuine curiosity, about a recent restoration project I'd completed for a regional museum. We talked for nearly 20 minutes, comfortably, and I remember thinking, in that moment, that perhaps some of the old wariness between our branches of the family had genuinely begun to soften over the preceding years. I mention this specifically because it makes what happened next, less than an hour later, feel even more disorienting in retrospect. The sense that the evening had been unfolding, up until that point, as something close to genuine warmth, before it suddenly, sharply, wasn't. The specific incident that opens this story happened near the dessert table, roughly 2 hours into the party, during a conversation that had started, innocuously enough, with a distant cousin asking Priscilla, within earshot of several other guests, about the family's long-term plans for the compound, now that Augusta was entering what everyone delicately referred to as her later years. Priscilla answered smoothly, confidently, describing plans that were, I understood immediately, based entirely on the previous, now superseded structure of the trust. Plans that assumed the compound and its collection would pass, eventually, to her, and then to Bitsy and Chip, the natural, expected continuation of the family's wealth along its familiar bloodline. I hadn't said anything throughout this conversation, genuinely uncertain of my place in it, standing slightly apart from the main cluster of guests. But at some point, the distant cousin, apparently aware of my ongoing restoration work at the compound and my growing closeness with Augusta, mentioned, casually, that it must be nice to have someone like Nadia so involved in preserving everything, given how much she clearly cares about it. Priscilla's expression shifted, sharply, in a way I recognized immediately as the specific, controlled irritation of someone who felt a threat had just been named aloud, however innocently, in a setting she considered entirely her own. That was when she turned, directly, toward me, and delivered the sentence that opens this entire story. Old money doesn't go to people like you, dear. It goes to people who actually understand how to carry it. The immediate silence that followed was the specific, uncomfortable silence of a room, realizing, all at once, that something had just been said that couldn't be smoothly absorbed back into ordinary party conversation. Several nearby guests looked away, visibly uncomfortable. I saw Bitsy, standing a few feet away, wince, almost imperceptibly, and glance toward her mother with an expression that suggested even she understood the comment had crossed some kind of line most of the room hadn't been prepared to watch crossed so openly. I did the thing I do every day in my workshop when something old and delicate is under more pressure than it looks equipped to bear. I set down my small plate of cake. I went still. I looked, carefully, at exactly where the actual pressure in that moment was coming from. Not really from me, I understood, standing there, but from decades of Priscilla's own carefully maintained assumptions about who this family's wealth was always going to belong to. Assumptions that were, at that exact moment, already 6 weeks out of date, though she had no way of knowing it yet. I understand why you'd think that, I said, evenly, not raising my voice, not matching the sharpness of her tone. I'm not going to argue with you about it here, at your mother's birthday party, in front of everyone who came to celebrate her. But I think, when the time actually comes, you might find that your mother has a different understanding of who spent the last several years actually carrying this family's history, rather than just assuming they'd eventually inherit it. Comment the word belong right now if you've ever had someone confidently draw a line around who's allowed to matter in a family, standing on the wrong side of information they didn't yet have. Because that's the exact moment this story turns. Priscilla's expression flickered, briefly, with something I couldn't fully read in the moment. Irritation, certainly, but also, perhaps, the faintest, earliest edge of uncertainty. She recovered quickly, offering a tight, dismissive laugh and turning back toward the other guests, clearly assuming she'd delivered a final, settled word on the subject. I didn't push further. I simply excused myself, quietly, and spent the remainder of the party in careful, measured conversation with Augusta herself, who, I noticed, watching from across the lawn, had witnessed at least part of the exchange, her expression unreadable in the specific way I'd come to recognize as her working something over, deliberately, in her own mind. Augusta passed away 11 months after that birthday party, peacefully, at the compound, with hospice care and, at her specific request, with me present during her final week, alongside Priscilla and the rest of the immediate family. I want to describe that final week a little more fully, because it matters for understanding the actual shape of Augusta's relationship with her family in her last days, complicated as it remained even at the very end. She spent much of that week drifting in and out of clear, lucid conversation, and during one particularly clear afternoon, roughly 3 days before she died, she asked to see me alone, without Priscilla present, and told me, quietly, holding my hand with a grip still surprisingly firm, I need you to promise me something. Once this is all settled, once the dust from all of it has cleared, I need you to actually let Priscilla back in, if she genuinely wants back in. Not because she deserves it automatically, because I think, underneath everything, she spent her whole life afraid of not being enough, the same way I was, for most of mine, and I don't want my decision to become the thing that finally convinces her she never will be. I promised her I would, though I remember, in that moment, genuinely uncertain whether such a reconciliation would ever actually prove possible. I also want to mention a smaller, quieter moment from that same week, because I've held on to it since. Priscilla, sitting beside her mother's bed one evening while I worked nearby restoring a small jewelry box Augusta had asked me to finish before she died, leaned over and said something to her mother I wasn't meant to hear, though the room was small enough that I did. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say to you, Mom," she said, quietly. "I feel like I've spent so long being annoyed at you for things I don't even fully remember anymore, and now there isn't going to be any more time to figure out what any of it was actually about." Augusta, weak but lucid, squeezed her daughter's hand and said only, "There's still time for you to figure out what matters most, sweetheart. Just maybe not with me." I think that exchange, more than anything that happened afterward, planted the actual seed of whatever genuine change eventually unfolded in Priscilla over the following year. I want to be honest that those final days were genuinely difficult. In all the ordinary ways watching someone you love decline is difficult, and that whatever tension existed between Priscilla and me remained, largely, unspoken during that period. Both of us focused, appropriately, on Augusta herself rather than on any unresolved family conflict. The formal reading of the trust took place 3 weeks after the funeral in Harold Whitfield's downtown office, with Priscilla, Bitsy, Chip, and myself all present, along with several extended family members with smaller, specific bequests outlined in Augusta's broader estate planning. Harold moved through the smaller provisions first, methodically, the way I imagine he'd done in countless similar readings over his long career. Modest, specific gifts to various charities Augusta had supported, personal items designated for particular family members, the kind of careful, thoughtful distribution that reflected genuine consideration for each person's specific relationship to her. I want to describe the room itself briefly, because I remember its particular, tense stillness with real clarity. Priscilla sat directly across from Harold's desk, dressed formally, composed in the specific, controlled way I'd come to recognize from her, occasionally glancing toward me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not hostile exactly, but watchful, the specific vigilance of someone bracing for something without yet knowing its precise shape. Bitsy sat beside her mother, quieter than usual, and Chip, across the room, checked his phone twice before Harold gently asked that all devices be set aside for the remainder of the reading. Then he reached the central provision, the disposition of the family trust itself, and I watched Priscilla's posture straighten, visibly, in anticipation of what she clearly still assumed would be the natural, expected outcome. Harold read the language carefully, precisely, exactly as Augusta had structured it 6 weeks before her birthday party, months before that exchange near the dessert table had even happened. The trust, holding the compound, its full collection, and its accompanying preservation endowment, valued altogether at just over $8.4 million, would pass entirely into my sole trusteeship and primary beneficial interest, governed by the specific stewardship provisions Augusta had personally dictated, provisions that explicitly, by name, cited my demonstrated, sustained commitment to the preservation and understanding of the family's actual history and craftsmanship as the basis for her decision. Priscilla's reaction, in that room, unfolded in stages I've thought about many times since. First, disbelief, a sharp, immediate insistence that there must be some error, some earlier document that superseded this one. "Read that again," she said, her voice tight. "That can't be the current version. There has to be an amendment somewhere, something more recent." Harold, patiently, confirmed that this was, in fact, the most recent and only legally operative version of the trust, executed and witnessed 6 weeks before Augusta's birthday, complete with contemporaneous documentation of her full mental competency at the time of signing, prepared specifically, he noted, in anticipation of exactly this kind of challenge. "This can't be right," Priscilla said again, finally, her voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. "She wouldn't have done this without telling me." Harold, gently, informed her that Augusta had, in fact, attempted to discuss it with her on at least 2 separate occasions in the weeks before her birthday, and had been told, each time, that the conversation could wait. He referenced, specifically, a note in his own file, dated 5 weeks before the party, documenting a phone call in which Augusta had expressed frustration that Priscilla had, in her words as recorded by Harold, changed the subject twice when I tried to bring up the future of the compound and told me we could discuss all of that after the party, once things had settled down. Priscilla's face went through a series of expressions I recognized, this time as genuine, unrehearsed grief beginning to surface underneath the shock. The particular grief of realizing a parent had tried, more than once, to tell you something important, and that your own impatience had cost you the chance to actually hear it while there was still time to respond. Chip, beside his mother, said nothing throughout most of this, though I noticed him watching Priscilla with a kind of quiet, uncertain concern I hadn't expected from him. Bitsy, finally, spoke, quietly, into the tense silence that followed. "Mom?" she said. "Did you actually not know? At all?" Priscilla shook her head slowly, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked, genuinely, entirely undefended. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because I think it's the actual heart of this story, more than the trust itself, more than the $8.4 million, more than any of the numbers. Priscilla turned to me, in that conference room, and asked, quietly, stripped of all the sharpness that had characterized every previous interaction between us, "Did you know? Before today, did you already know she'd done this?" I told her the truth. I'd known for 11 months, since that quiet afternoon 6 weeks before the birthday party, and I'd honored Augusta's request to keep it private until she'd had the chance to discuss it with Priscilla herself. A chance Priscilla had, without realizing it, repeatedly declined to take. "So when I said that thing to you," Priscilla said, slowly, working it through, at the party, "about old money not going to people like you already knew, by then, that she'd already." "Yes," I said, gently, not with any satisfaction, because there genuinely wasn't any satisfaction in watching someone absorb this particular kind of grief. "I already knew. I want to tell you honestly about the months that followed, because I don't think this story resolves cleanly into simple triumph, and I don't think it should." Priscilla contested the trust initially, through her own attorney, a process that ultimately went nowhere, given the thoroughness of Augusta's documentation and the clear, contemporaneous evidence of her full competency and consistent intent. But more significantly, and more slowly, something else began to unfold alongside that initial legal conflict. A genuine, difficult reckoning on Priscilla's part with exactly how much of her relationship to her own mother and to this family's history had been built around assumption rather than actual engagement. I want to describe the specific unraveling of that legal contest a little more fully, because I think it matters for understanding how Priscilla eventually arrived at a genuinely different place. Her attorney, reviewing the file Harold had assembled, apparently advised her within the first few weeks that pursuing a formal challenge was unlikely to succeed and would, in all probability, simply generate significant legal expense while further damaging whatever remained of her relationship with me and with the rest of the family who'd witnessed the trust reading. Priscilla told me, much later, that hearing her own attorney lay out, plainly, exactly how weak her position actually was had been its own kind of difficult reckoning. A moment where the last, thin hope that this might all simply be undone by legal technicality finally, fully collapsed, leaving her with nothing to do but actually sit with what had happened. She reached out to me, roughly 4 months after the trust reading, asking if she could come see the compound, not to relitigate anything, she said, but because she realized, sitting with everything that had happened, that she genuinely didn't know the history of most of what was in that house, beyond its appraisal value, and she wanted, finally, to actually learn it. I agreed, cautiously, uncertain, in that moment, whether her request was genuine or simply another attempt to reposition herself. But that visit, and the several that followed over the following year, gradually convinced me otherwise. I want to describe the first of those visits specifically, because it was, in many ways, the most difficult and the most important. Priscilla arrived alone, without Bitsy or Chip, dressed more simply than I'd ever seen her, and she asked, almost hesitantly, if we could start with the room where her mother had died, a request that surprised me, given how carefully she'd avoided any direct engagement with her mother's final months throughout the funeral and the weeks immediately following it. We sat together in that room for nearly an hour, mostly in silence, and at one point, Priscilla said, quietly. I think I spent so much of my adult life assuming I already understood my mother completely that I never actually asked her anything real. I think I mistook familiarity for actually knowing someone. I didn't have a perfect response to that in the moment. I simply told her I thought that was a genuinely honest thing to say out loud, and that I thought her mother would have appreciated hearing it, even this late. Over the following visits, I walked her through the same stories Augusta had once walked me through. The actual provenance of specific pieces, the craftsmanship behind them, the history that had accumulated, generation after generation, into something far more meaningful than a simple number on an estate valuation. I showed her the cigar box of old photographs Augusta had shared with me years earlier, including the same photograph of Augusta and my grandmother as young girls, arms around each other, taken long before whatever quiet family calculus would eventually separate them. Priscilla held that photograph for a long time, the same way Augusta once had, and asked, quietly, if she could have a copy made for herself. I told her, of course, and made sure she received one the following week. I want to describe one specific afternoon from those visits, because I think it captures something genuinely important about how this story eventually resolved. We were standing in front of the same writing desk I'd been restoring the very first day I met Augusta, years earlier, and Priscilla, running her hand carefully along its repaired surface, said, quietly, I think I spent my whole life assuming this family's wealth was the point. I don't think I ever once asked what it was actually protecting. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something that genuinely moved me. I'm sorry for what I said to you at the party. I think some part of me already sensed, even then, that I'd stopped actually understanding what any of this was for, and it was easier to be cruel about who did understand it than to sit with what that meant about me. I've since restructured the trust's governance, formally, to include Bitsy and Chip in an advisory capacity. And, eventually, Priscilla herself, once it became clear her engagement was genuine rather than strategic. Not because I felt obligated to, but because I came to believe, watching her slow, sincere effort to actually learn what she'd spent decades assuming she already understood, that Augusta's actual goal had never been to punish her family, but to protect something specific until someone was ready to genuinely carry it forward, whether that person arrived by blood alone or, as it turned out, by something closer to demonstrated care. I want to mention, too, that Bitsy has become, unexpectedly, one of my closest collaborators in the years since. She began, at first tentatively, and then with genuine enthusiasm, learning some of the basics of furniture restoration herself, spending weekends in my workshop, developing a real, hands-on relationship to the family's history that none of us, including her, had anticipated when this whole story began. Chip's engagement has remained more distant, though respectful, and I've come to accept that not every member of this family was going to arrive at the same place or at the same pace, and that this, too, was probably something Augusta had understood better than any of us at the time she made her decision. The compound remains standing, its collection carefully preserved rather than liquidated, exactly as Augusta intended, funded by an endowment that continues to support both its physical maintenance and a small educational program I've since established, teaching traditional furniture restoration techniques to young apprentices who might otherwise never have access to this specific, disappearing craft. I named the program, quietly, after my grandmother Constance, the sister who married the carpenter and was quietly written out of a family social register for it, decades before anyone in that family finally, fully understood what she'd actually been protecting all along. I want to tell you about one more thing before I close this out, because it happened almost 2 years after Augusta's death, and I think it circles back to where this whole story actually began. One of my first apprentices through the new program, a quiet, careful young man named Teddy, came to me one afternoon, frustrated, holding a badly cracked chair leg he'd been assigned to repair, insisting the piece was simply too far gone to save. I sat with him for a long while, the way Augusta had once sat with me, and showed him exactly what I'd learned to look for over 15 years of this work. Not whether something looked broken beyond repair, but where, specifically, its actual remaining strength was still holding, however thin that margin might appear at first glance. Everyone assumes the crack is the whole story, I told him, turning the chair leg carefully in the light. But the crack is just where the stress finally showed itself. The actual story is everything underneath it that's still holding, that decided this whole time not to fully give way. Teddy worked on that chair leg for another 2 weeks, carefully, patiently, and eventually saved it. A repair so seamless that, mounted back into its original chair, almost no one would ever know it had once been considered beyond saving. I think about that afternoon often, turning it over the same way I once turned over so many of Augusta's own lessons, because I've come to believe it's actually the truest metaphor for everything that happened in this family, across 3 generations, long before I was ever born into the middle of it. My grandmother Constance was written off, decades ago, as a piece the family had decided wasn't worth the trouble of understanding fully. Augusta spent much of her life believing the same cold, careful distance was simply how such losses had to be managed, until, very late, she finally looked closely enough to see where the actual strength in that relationship had been quietly holding the whole time. And Priscilla, for all her early cruelty, eventually did the same thing, however painfully and however late. Looked closely enough, finally, to understand that what she'd assumed was broken beyond any real relationship had simply never been given the patient attention it needed to reveal what was actually still there. I don't think any of this happened because I was somehow special, or because I set out, deliberately, to prove anything to anyone. I think it happened because I did the same thing, patiently, over and over, that I do every single day with a 200-year-old joint that looks cracked but isn't broken. I paid attention. I didn't force anything. And I waited, without any real expectation of reward, to see exactly what was actually still there, underneath all the assumptions everyone else had already decided were true. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you've ever been told, explicitly or in 1,000 smaller ways, that you simply weren't built for what your own family had. Belonging was never really about blood alone, and it was never really about money either. It's about who actually shows up, patiently, consistently, to understand and care for the things that matter, long before anyone's watching or keeping score. Sometimes the people who inherited the most obvious claim to something are the ones who understand it least. And sometimes, the people standing at the edge of the room, quietly doing the careful, unglamorous work nobody else thought to do, are the ones who end up holding the whole thing together. Comment the word belong one more time if you made it all the way to the end. I want to know exactly who stayed with me for this whole story. Subscribe to Pieces of Us. My aunt said old money doesn't go to people like me. She just never thought to ask whose name was already written into the only document that actually mattered.